Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Like the people you raised suddenly couldn't see you standing right in front of them? What I am about to tell you happened to me at 72 years old, and it nearly shattered everything I thought I knew about mother-son bonds. But by the end of this story, you will understand why sometimes the people who claim to love you most need the hardest wake-up calls about basic human dignity. It started with an envelope that felt too heavy for my heart to carry. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had fed my son Michael every morning for 18 years, when the mail arrived. The envelope was thick, expensive, the kind that announces important life events. My hands actually shook as I opened it, because at 72, you learn that heavy envelopes can bring joy or devastation in equal measure. The mailwoman, Sally, had given me a meaningful look when she handed it over. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Coleman," she had said with the careful tone people use when they sense trouble brewing. Sally had been delivering mail to our rural route for 15 years. She had seen the gradual changes in my life, the way packages from Michael had stopped coming, the way my phone had stopped ringing as frequently, the way I had started checking the mailbox with desperate hope rather than casual interest. Inside was a wedding invitation. My son's wedding invitation. But as I read the elegant script, something inside my chest began to crumble like old mortar between bricks. "Robert and Patricia Chen request the pleasure of your company at the marriage of their daughter, Jessica Marie Chen, to Michael James Coleman. The ceremony will take place at Coleman Family Farm, followed by reception in the barn and gardens." My farm, the property I had inherited when my husband Frank died 12 years ago. The land where I had raised Michael alone from age 10, working myself to exhaustion to keep us afloat. After Frank's sudden heart attack left us with nothing but debt, determination, and a mortgage that felt like a mountain. But according to this invitation, I didn't exist. Not as a host, not as the groom's mother, not even as the owner of the property where they planned to celebrate. I was addressed simply as Mrs. Franklin Coleman, as if I had no identity beyond being the widow of a dead man. As if the 26 years I had spent raising Michael since Frank's death were just a footnote in someone else's story. An inconvenient detail that could be glossed over with proper stationery. I sat there in the silence of my empty house, feeling something I had never experienced before. Not sadness. Exactly. Not anger, though that would come later. Something worse. The slow, dawning realization that I had become invisible to my own child. The child I had carried for 9 months, nursed through midnight fevers, comforted through nightmares, cheered at baseball games, celebrated through graduations. The memories came flooding back, unbidden and painful, like water through a broken dam. Michael at 10, clinging to me after his father's funeral, his small body shaking with sobs as he whispered, "You are all I have left, Mama." Michael at 16, proudly introducing me to his friends as the strongest woman in the world after I had worked 3 jobs to pay for his class trip to Washington, D.C. Michael at 22, calling me from college on a random Tuesday night just to say, "I couldn't have done any of this without you. Mom, I love you so much." When had those words stopped being true? When had I stopped mattering? When had the woman who had sacrificed everything for his happiness become someone who could be erased from his most important day? I thought about the past 2 years since Jessica entered our lives like a perfectly groomed storm. She was beautiful in that calculated way that some women achieve through expensive salons and designer clothes, and a confidence that comes from never having to choose between groceries and gas money. She had manicured nails while mine were permanently stained from garden soil and dish soap. She wore clothes that cost more than my monthly budget while I shopped at thrift stores and mended holes until fabric couldn't hold another stitch. She spoke casually about investments and market trends while I counted pennies for groceries and prayed my old truck would pass inspection one more year. But I had tried so hard to welcome her into our family. I had invited them for dinner every month, always cooking Michael's favorite foods from childhood. The pot roast that took all day to prepare. The apple pie made from fruit grown on our own trees, The cornbread that Frank had loved so much, he would ask for seconds before he had finished his first piece. I had asked Jessica about her work, her family, her interests, genuinely wanting to know the woman who had captured my son's heart. I had complimented her clothes, her car, her accomplishments, searching desperately for common ground where we could build a relationship. I had bitten my tongue when she suggested improvements to my farmhouse during those early visits, walking through my kitchen with the calculating gaze of someone mentally measuring for renovations. I had smiled politely when she rearranged my furniture to create better flow for entertaining, moving pieces that Frank had built with his own hands to places where they looked aesthetically pleasing but felt emotionally wrong. I had nodded agreeably when she spoke about my home as if it were a project waiting for her expertise, a diamond in the rough that could shine with the right vision and enough money. I had told myself that her coolness toward me was just her personality, that some people took longer to warm up than others, that her failure to include me in conversations when the three of us were together was just generational difference, that young people naturally gravitated toward topics I wouldn't understand, that her tendency to interrupt when I was speaking wasn't disrespect, but enthusiasm, that her habit of checking her phone while I told stories about Michael's childhood wasn't rudeness, but the way modern people multitasked. But this invitation proved what I had been afraid to acknowledge for months. Jessica hadn't just failed to warm up to me. She would systematically worked to erase me from Michael's life, and he would let her do it. He would not just let her, he had helped her. I walked through my farmhouse with new eyes, seeing all the changes that had appeared gradually over the past year, like symptoms of a disease I had been too naive to diagnose. Fresh paint and colors. I never would have chosen cool grays and stark whites that made the rooms feel like magazine photos rather than lived in spaces. New curtains that blocked the view of Frank's apple orchard, the trees he had planted the year Michael was born because he wanted his son to grow up understanding where food came from. Kitchen appliances arranged for efficiency rather than comfort. The coffee pot moved from beside the window, where I had always kept it so I could watch the sunrise while brewing my morning cup. My grandmother's quilts had been folded away and stored in a closet, replaced with store-bought throw pillows that had no history, no meaning, no stories embedded in their fibers. The wooden bowl Frank had carved for our wedding anniversary no longer sat on the kitchen table filled with fruit from our own trees. Instead, there was a sleek ceramic centerpiece that Jessica had brought from some expensive home goods store. Beautiful but cold, perfect but soulless. They had been remaking my home without asking my opinion, transforming it into something more suitable for their vision of rural elegance. And I had been so grateful for any attention from Michael, so desperate to maintain our connection, that I had mistaken invasion for inclusion, control for care. The worst part wasn't the changes to my house. It was the changes to my son. Michael used to call me every Sunday morning at exactly 9 of the clock, right after his shower. But before his coffee had time to get cold, we had talk about everything and nothing, the weather patterns that would affect my garden, the neighbors who had stopped by during the week, his work projects and office politics, my attempts to keep the farm running on Social Security and stubbornness. He would ask about my arthritis on rainy days, remind me to check my blood pressure medication, worry aloud about whether I was eating enough vegetables and getting enough social interaction. He would end every conversation the same way he had since childhood. Love you, Mama. Not love you or love ya like casual acquaintances, but love you, Mama, the same words he had whispered to me when I tucked him into bed as a small boy, when he had been afraid of storms or monsters or the dark spaces under his bed where fears lived. Those calls had gradually become monthly, then sporadic, then obligatory. The warmth had drained out of his voice like air from a punctured tire, replaced by the polite efficiency he probably used with insurance salesmen and grocery store clerks. Our conversations became updates rather than connections, information exchanges rather than emotional intimacy. He would ask about my health like a doctor following a checklist, rather than a son who remembered holding my hand during his father's funeral. He would mention work stress without inviting comfort, discuss his plans without asking for advice, share good news without seeking someone to celebrate with. and I had accepted it all. I had told myself it was natural for adult children to become independent, that I should be proud of raising a son who didn't need constant emotional support from his mother. I had convinced myself that distance was healthy, that clinging would only push him further away, that I should be grateful for whatever attention he could spare from his busy, successful, sophisticated life. But sitting there with that invitation in my hands, I realized I had been lying to myself. This wasn't healthy independence. This was abandonment dressed up as maturity, rejection disguised as growth. This was my son choosing a new family while systematically dismantling the one that had raised him. I thought about Frank, about what he would say if he could see this invitation. Frank, who had worked 2 jobs to scrape together the down payment for this farm, who had spent every weekend and vacation building fences and repairing barns and expanding the house 1 room at a time as we could afford the materials. Frank, who had told Michael bedtime stories about the day his son would inherit this land and carry on the Coleman legacy, who had taught him to drive on these back roads and to fish in the pond behind the barn and to respect the land that provided their livelihood. Frank would be heartbroken. Not just because Michael was getting married without properly including his mother, but because Michael had forgotten what this place meant, what it cost, what it represented. This farm wasn't just property with a mailing address and tax assessment. It was 3 generations of Coleman sweat and dreams and sacrifice. It was Frank's grandfather homesteading this land in 1923 with nothing but determination and a government promise of opportunity for those willing to work for it. It was Frank's father expanding the property during the Great Depression by trading his carpentry skills for additional acreage, when cash money was scarce, but skilled labor was always in demand. It was Frank himself spending 40 years building everything from the ground up, board by board, fence post by fence post, season by season. This was the foundation that had made Michael's education possible, that had given him the stability to build his own success, that had provided the security he had needed to take risks and pursue dreams. This was the place where Frank had taught him to be a man of integrity, where I would taught him to be kind to people who had less than he did, where we would both taught him that family comes first and that you never forget where you came from. And now he was using it as a free wedding venue while treating me like a distant relative who deserved a courtesy invitation. Something shifted inside me then, like a geological fault that had been building pressure for years, finally reaching its breaking point. Not anger, exactly, though that would come. Something deeper and more permanent. The recognition that I had been participating in my own erasure, enabling my own invisibility, accepting crumbs when I deserved a seat at the table where decisions about my own life were being made. I stood up slowly, my 72-year-old body protesting after sitting still for so long while my world realigned itself around this new reality. My reflection in the kitchen window showed a woman I barely recognized, gray-haired and tired, smaller than I remembered being, wearing clothes that hung on a frame that had shrunk over the years from hard work and insufficient nutrition and the stress of carrying everyone else's burdens while ignoring my own needs. When had I started shrinking? When had I begun taking up less space in my own life? When had I accepted the role of supporting character in the story I was supposed to be starring in? I found myself walking to Frank's old office, now converted to my sewing room where I mended clothes that should have been replaced years ago and quilted blankets for charity because I needed something productive to do with my hands during the long evening hours when the phone didn't ring and no one visited and the silence of the house felt like a living thing pressing against my chest. In the metal filing cabinet that Frank had bought used from a business that was closing down, behind folders of tax returns and insurance papers and medical bills that chronicled the gradual decay of everything I had tried to maintain, was the deed to this property. I pulled it out with trembling hands that bore the scars of decades spent working without proper tools, because we couldn't afford to replace things that broke. Margaret Louise Coleman and Franklin David Coleman, joint tenants with right of survivorship. The legal language that meant when Frank died, this farm became mine completely and entirely, not Michael's, not Jessica's, not her parents', who were apparently hosting a wedding on land they had no legal right to use, no emotional connection to, no understanding of. The irony was bitter and complete. They were planning to celebrate Michael's new beginning on property I owned, at an event where I was treated as an afterthought, using my land as a backdrop for their vision of rural elegance, while the woman who had kept this place running for 12 years without a partner was relegated to the guest list, like someone who had won a contest rather than someone who had built the prize they were enjoying. I sat with that deed for a long time, feeling its weight in my hands like a weapon I had never known I possessed. This single document represented everything Frank and I had built together through 40 years of marriage. Every early morning when we had risen before dawn to tend animals, every late night when we had counted money and worried about bills, every season when we had prayed for good weather and fair prices and the kind of luck that poor people need more than rich people can understand. This was everything we had sacrificed to create, everything we had hoped to pass down to our son as evidence that ordinary people could build extraordinary legacies through daily choices made with love and intention, and the stubborn refusal to accept that circumstances had to define possibilities. And Michael was treating it like free real estate, a convenient venue for impressing his fiancé's sophisticated family who would probably never seen a working farm except in magazines. The phone felt heavy when I finally picked it up to call him, like I was lifting something much more substantial than plastic and electronics. I was lifting years of accumulated hurt and disappointment, and the weight of realizing that the person I had loved most in the world had stopped seeing me as someone worth consulting about decisions that affected my own property, my own life, my own heart. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted in the way that had become his default tone during our increasingly rare conversations. "Hi, Mom. What is up? I am kind of in the middle of something. Always in the middle of something. Always busy with priorities that didn't include me. Always treating my calls like interruptions rather than opportunities for connection. I received your wedding invitation today." "Oh, great. I was wondering when those would arrive. Jessica handled all the printing details since she is better at that kind of thing than I am, better at that kind of thing than he was." As if acknowledging his own mother on his wedding invitation was some complex skill that required special expertise rather than basic human decency. I noticed my name doesn't appear anywhere on it. Silence. Then, in a tone that suggested he was struggling to understand why this might matter. "What do you mean?" My voice remained steady, though my heart was racing, like I had just run a mile, instead of simply spoken a truth that should have been obvious to anyone with functioning eyes and a working conscience. "Jessica's parents are listed as the hosts of a wedding taking place on my property. There is no mention of the groom's mother." "Mom, it is just etiquette. The bride's family traditionally hosts the wedding. It doesn't mean anything personal. Doesn't mean anything personal." My erasure from my own son's wedding was just etiquette, just tradition, just the way things were done in Jessica's world, where mothers like me apparently didn't count as real family. "Do Jessica's parents own this farm, Michael?" "Well, no. But have you asked my permission to use my property for your wedding?" The silence stretched longer this time, and I could practically hear him calculating responses, trying to find words that would smooth this over without acknowledging the fundamental disrespect of the situation. This was the son I had raised to tell the truth even when it was uncomfortable, to take responsibility for his actions even when it was easier to make excuses, to treat other people with the same respect he wanted for himself. "Mom, we didn't think you had mind. You have always said we were welcome here. It is not like we are strangers or something. There is a difference between being welcome as my son and being granted permission to use my property as a commercial venue." Michael, his voice took on that careful, patient tone he had started using with me over the past year. The way people speak to elderly relatives they consider slightly confused about the modern world. "Look, can we talk about this tomorrow? We are supposed to meet with the caterer anyway to discuss setup details." Setup details. For an event on my property that I had never been consulted about, that I had never agreed to host, that treated me like hired help rather than the owner of the venue and the mother of the groom. Yes, I think we need to talk. But don't bring any vendors to my property until we have had that conversation. Mom, you are not being reasonable. I am being perfectly reasonable. This is my home, my land, my decision. I will see you tomorrow. I hung up before he could argue further, before he could use that patronizing tone to explain why I was overreacting, why I was making this more complicated than it needed to be, why I should be grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion they were willing to offer. After hanging up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my kitchen, feeling more alone than I had since Frank died. But it was a different kind of loneliness, not the ache of missing someone who had loved me completely, but the hollow recognition that someone I loved with every fiber of my being had stopped seeing me as a person worth consulting, worth including, worth respecting. That night, I lay awake in the bedroom I had shared with Frank for 37 years, staring at the ceiling he had painted white because I had mentioned once that it would make the room feel larger and brighter during the dark winter months when depression could settle on farming communities like a physical weight. Outside, the cicadas sang their summer song, the same chorus that had lulled me to sleep for decades. But tonight their music sounded different, less peaceful, more urgent, as if they were trying to warn me about something I had been too naive or too hopeful to see coming. I thought about all the signs I had ignored over the past 2 years, the way Jessica's eyes would glaze over when I spoke, as if she was waiting for me to finish, so she could redirect the conversation to topics she found more interesting. The way Michael would change the subject when I mentioned feeling left out of their plans, steering our conversations toward safer territory where my feelings couldn't complicate his relationship. The way they would both begin speaking about me in the third person, even when I was standing right there, discussing my health, my finances, my future as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be included. I had been disappearing gradually, so slowly that I hadn't noticed until I was nearly gone, like a photograph left in sunlight, fading imperceptibly, until one day you realize that what used to be clear and vivid has become ghostly and transparent. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of Frank shaking his head sadly. "You let them erase you, Maggie," he said, using the nickname only he had ever called me, the one that made me feel cherished rather than merely identified. "You forgot who you are. You forgot what you are worth." I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to participate in my own disappearance anymore. I wasn't going to enable my own invisibility. I wasn't going to accept being treated like an inconvenience in my own life. When Michael and Jessica arrived the next morning, I was ready for them. I had dressed carefully in my best blouse, and the pearl earrings Frank had given me for our 20th wedding anniversary. Armor that reminded me I was someone worth respecting. I had set out photo albums showing the farm's history, evidence of the legacy they were treating so casually. I had prepared what I wanted to say, practicing in the mirror until my voice was steady and strong. They came in Jessica's white BMW, followed by a catering van with elegant affairs painted on the side in script letters that matched the wedding invitation. I watched from my kitchen window as they directed workers around my property without once glancing toward the house where I lived, making decisions about my land as if I were irrelevant to the process of planning an event that would take place in my backyard. Jessica wore a white sundress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and shoes that would be completely impractical for walking on farm ground, but looked perfect for directing other people to do work she didn't want to dirty her hands with. Michael had dressed down for the occasion in khakis and a polo shirt, playing the role of a country gentleman returning to his rustic roots, rather than a man who had learned to work with his hands in these same fields. I waited until they finished giving instructions to the caterers before stepping onto my front porch. Michael waved nervously when he saw me, the gesture of someone who knew he was in trouble, but wasn't sure exactly why. Jessica's smile was polite, but strained, the expression of someone who considered me an obstacle to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. "Good morning, Mrs. Coleman," Jessica said with careful courtesy that felt rehearsed, like she had practiced being nice to difficult people. "I hope we didn't disturb you with all the activity." "You did disturb me," I replied quietly. my voice carrying in the morning air that still held the coolness of night. But not with the noise. I led them inside to my living room, the same space where I had rocked Michael to sleep as a baby when he had colic, and only my voice could calm him. The same room where I had helped him with homework at the coffee table Frank had built from wood cut on our own property. The same room where I had held him when he cried about his father's death, promising him that we would get through the grief together, that we would honor Frank's memory by taking care of each other, and the land he had loved. Now it felt like a courtroom where I was about to present evidence in a case that shouldn't have needed to be made. "I have something to show you," I said, placing the property deed on the coffee table between us, like a truth that could no longer be ignored. Michael looked confused, as if the concept of legal property ownership was too complex for him to grasp in relation to his childhood home. Jessica's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that she understood exactly what this document meant and why I was showing it to them. "Mom, what is this about?" "This is about respect, Michael. About acknowledgement. About basic human decency. About the fact that you are planning a wedding on property I own without asking my permission, or including me in any meaningful way." "We included you. You are invited." The simplicity of his response, the genuine confusion in his voice, broke something inside me that I hadn't realized was still holding together. "Am I? Because this invitation addresses me as your father's widow, not as your mother. It lists Jessica's parents as hosts of an event on my land. It treats me like a stranger who deserves a courtesy invitation rather than the woman who raised you and owns the property where you are planning to celebrate." Jessica leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she probably used with difficult clients who didn't understand why they needed the pharmaceutical products she was selling. "Mrs. Coleman, this isn't personal. Wedding planning is incredibly stressful, and we were trying to keep things simple by centralizing the coordination with one family." "Simple for whom?" "It is certainly simple to erase people you find inconvenient." "That is not what happened," Michael said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction, as if he was starting to realize that maybe it was exactly what had happened. "Isn't it?" I kept my voice calm, though my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. "When did you last ask my opinion about anything that matters? When did you last visit without an agenda? When did you last call just to hear my voice, just to connect with someone who loves you unconditionally?" The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stared at his hands like they held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. Jessica calculated responses behind her carefully constructed mask of polite concern. "I want corrected invitations sent to every guest," I said finally, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "I want my name included as co-host because this is my property and my son, and I want an apology for being treated like hired help instead of family." Jessica's composure cracked slightly, revealing the impatience underneath her polished exterior. "An apology for what, exactly?" "For months of renovating my house without consulting me about my preferences, for planning a wedding on my land without asking my permission, for treating me like an obstacle to be managed instead of a person to be respected." "We have been improving this place," Jessica said, her voice rising with indignation that suggested she genuinely couldn't understand why I wasn't grateful for her uninvited improvements. "We have spent thousands of dollars making upgrades that have increased the property value. Improvements I didn't request on property. I didn't give you permission to alter. When did I become too incompetent to make decisions about my own home?" Michael finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than I remembered it being. "Mom, we were trying to help. The house needed work, and we thought you would be happy that we were taking care of things. Help would have been asking what I needed and listening to my answer, instead of assuming you knew better than I did about my own life and my own property." Jessica stood up, her polite mask finally slipping completely to reveal the irritation she had been hiding behind practiced courtesy. "This is ridiculous. We have done nothing but try to include you and improve your living situation." "Include me? I have been excluded from every decision about my own property. I have been erased from my own son's wedding planning. You have treated me like a project to be managed rather than a person to be respected. You are being overly dramatic, Jessica said. And the moment the words left her mouth, I could see from Michael's expression that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I felt something crystallize inside me, like water turning to ice in temperatures that had been hovering at the freezing point for months. I think it is time for both of you to leave. Mom, please, Michael started. But I held up my hand. Number, come back when you are ready to have an honest conversation about respect and boundaries. Until then, no wedding preparations take place on this property. Jessica's eyes flashed with something between anger and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite comprehend that someone like me would dare to stand up to someone like her. You cannot be serious. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. This is my land, my home, my decision. You have no legal right to use this property without my explicit permission. And right now, you don't have it. Michael looked stricken, like a child who had been caught doing something he knew was wrong, but had hoped no one would notice. Mom, you cannot cancel our wedding. I am not canceling anything. I am simply withdrawing permission to use my property until we can reach an understanding about how I will be treated and acknowledged in my own son's life. They left without another word, Jessica stalking to her car with the indignant fury of someone who wasn't accustomed to being told no by people she considered beneath her station. Michael lingered on the porch like a lost child, looking back at the house where he had been raised as if seeing it clearly for the first time in years. I watched them drive away, followed by the catering van, whose driver looked confused about why the consultation had ended so abruptly. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. By myself, if no one else. The afternoon passed quietly. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the front porch where Frank and I had spent countless evenings planning the next day's work and counting our blessings and dreaming about the future we were building together. Every fence post I could see represented a choice we had made together, a vision we had built with our own hands and hearts and stubborn determination to create something lasting that could be passed down to our children. The phone rang at dinner time. As I was heating up leftover soup that would have to last me another 2 days because Social Security only stretched so far and pride had prevented me from telling Michael how tight money had become since the farm stopped being profitable and started being just an expensive piece of nostalgia. Michael's voice was subdued when I answered, stripped of the confident efficiency he had been using with me for the past year. Mom, I talked to Jessica. We want to work this out. I am listening. First, I want to apologize. For the invitation, for not asking permission to use the farm, for taking you for granted. You are right about all of it. I waited. Apologies were easy when the alternative was losing something you wanted. Change was harder. Change required admitting that you had been wrong, not just about one thing, but about a whole pattern of behavior that had been building for years. We would like to come over tomorrow and discuss how to fix this. Jessica has some ideas about correcting the invitations and including you properly in the planning. And I want to understand how I let things get so far off track. I never meant to hurt you, Mom. I just got caught up in trying to please Jessica and her family, and I forgot what mattered most. The admission was small but significant, like the first crack in ice that has been frozen solid all winter. What time tomorrow? Whatever works for you. This is your house, your schedule. We will work around your availability after hanging up. I sat in Frank's old chair and thought about forgiveness. Not the kind that forgets everything and pretends nothing happened, but the kind that remembers the hurt while choosing to move forward anyway. The kind that requires real change, not just prettier words. The next morning brought rain, steady and cleansing, washing the world clean in the way that only summer storms can do. Michael and Jessica arrived separately. He in his practical sedan that still had the dent in the passenger door from when he would hit a deer during his senior year of high school. She in the BMW that somehow managed to look pristine even in weather that turned my gravel driveway into a muddy mess. I had prepared carefully for this conversation. Photo albums showing the farm's history lay open on the kitchen table, Pictures of Frank building the barn board by board, of Michael as a child helping with chores and looking so proud to be trusted with real responsibility, of our family creating this legacy together through decades of hard work and shared dreams. Before we talk about correcting invitations, I said, as they settled into chairs around the table where we had shared thousands of meals, I want you to understand what this place means, not just as property, but as history, as sacrifice, as love made visible. As we looked through the photos, I watched Jessica's expression change. The calculating coolness she usually wore when looking at my house began to soften as she saw the context behind every improvement Frank and I had made. She began asking questions about the farm's history, about the sacrifices that had made Michael's opportunities possible, about the man who had built the foundation for everything we were celebrating. "I never understood," she said quietly, running her finger along the edge of a photo, showing Frank teaching 10-year-old Michael how to properly stack hay bales. "I thought I was helping by modernizing things, making them more efficient. I didn't realize I was erasing history." Michael picked up a photo of himself at 8, standing proudly beside his 4-H calf that had won first place at the county fair. His face in the picture was radiant with the pure joy of a child who felt important, who felt like his efforts mattered, who felt unconditionally loved and supported. "I remember this," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion I hadn't heard from him in years. "I thought I was so important, showing off for the judges and the other kids. You were important, you still are, but somewhere along the way, you forgot that this place made you who you are, that your success grew from roots planted in this soil by people who loved you enough to sacrifice everything for your future. I guess I started seeing it as just property instead of home," he admitted, and it was the first completely honest thing he had said to me in months. Just an asset instead of a legacy. We spent the next hour working out the practical details of corrected invitations and revised planning processes. Jessica would contact the printer about new cards acknowledging that the wedding was hosted by the Coleman and Chen families at Coleman Family Farm. By gracious permission of Margaret Coleman, my name would appear as co-host, and a small note would explain the farm's significance to the Coleman family history. But more importantly, we talked, really talked, the way we used to when Michael was growing up and trusted me enough to share his fears and dreams and complicated feelings about a world that didn't always make sense. We talked about how Jessica's need for control had collided with my need for respect, about how Michael's desire to please his fiancée had led him to abandon the woman who had raised him, about how I had been so afraid of losing him that I had enabled my own disappearance. "There is one more thing," Michael said as they prepared to leave, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he had been thinking about this for longer than just the past few days. "I want you to walk me down the aisle." I blinked, certain I would misheard. "What? Instead of walking alone, I want you to escort me to the altar." "It is not traditional, but neither is anything else about this situation. You raised me, Mom. You should be the one to present me to my new family." The gesture brought unexpected tears, not of sadness, but of recognition. Of being seen again after feeling invisible for so long, of mattering again to the person who had mattered most to me since the day he was born. "Are you sure? That is a significant departure from conventional wedding protocol." "I have never been more sure of anything." "Will you do it?" I looked at Jessica, expecting resistance, or at least reluctance, but she was smiling with what appeared to be genuine warmth rather than her usual calculated politeness. "I think it is perfect," she said. "I wish I had thought of it myself. It honors what you have given him and what you mean to this family." The wedding, when it finally took place 3 weeks later, bore little resemblance to the event they would originally planned. The corrected invitations had required awkward phone calls to explain the changes, but most guests seemed genuinely pleased to learn more about the farm's history and the woman who had preserved it through decades of challenge and change. Several of Frank's old friends attended, people I hadn't seen in years who shared stories about his craftsmanship and generosity, and the way he had always been willing to help neighbors with projects that required more hands than one family could provide. The local pastor who had officiated at Frank's funeral offered a blessing that acknowledged the generations of love that had prepared this ground for celebration. Jessica wore her grandmother's wedding dress instead of the designer gown she would originally chosen, and the ceremony included readings about family legacy and the importance of honoring the past while building the future. When Michael and I walked down the makeshift aisle together, my arm linked through his, I felt Frank's presence in every step we took across the land he had loved. During the reception, I found myself talking with guests who had known Frank, sharing stories about the farm's history, feeling connected to my own life again, in ways I had forgotten were possible. Jessica, no longer the ice princess in designer clothes, but a young woman wearing her grandmother's lace and her own genuine smile, asked me to teach her Frank's apple cider recipe. "I want to learn about this place," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity that seemed real rather than performed about what it means to be a Coleman, about the stories that made Michael who he is. Late that evening, as the last guests departed and the caterers packed up their equipment with the efficient movements of people who had done this many times before, Michael found me on the front porch where I had spent countless evenings with Frank, planning dreams and counting blessings. "Thank you, Mom," he said, settling into the chair beside me with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged in this space, "for everything, for raising me, for building this place, for not giving up on us when we lost our way." "Families lose their way sometimes," I replied, watching fireflies dance over the pasture where he had learned to catch lightning bugs in mason jars when he was small enough to believe that magic was real and mothers could fix anything. "The important thing is finding each other again before the distance becomes permanent. I will not forget again, I promise." This promise felt different from the ones he had made as a child. This one was made by a man who had learned the cost of forgetting, who had seen what happened when love was taken for granted instead of nurtured with intention and respect. Jessica joined us a few minutes later, her wedding dress replaced by jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, instead of styled into the perfect updo she had worn for the ceremony. She looked younger this way, more genuine, less armored against the world, and more open to its possibilities. "Mrs. Coleman, I wanted to thank you too, for teaching me that families aren't just about getting what you want. They are about giving what people need, even when it is uncomfortable. Welcome to the family, Jessica. Really welcome this time." She hugged me then, and it felt genuine instead of obligatory, the embrace of someone who was choosing connection rather than performing it. The three of us sat together on the porch where I had raised my son, watching the last of the wedding guests disappear down the gravel road that Frank had built with his own hands and maintained with stubborn pride. The months that followed brought gradual healing, like a broken bone that knits itself back together, slowly but stronger than before. Michael called every Sunday again, not out of obligation, but because he had remembered the joy of connection. Jessica visited on weekends, asking to learn my recipes and my gardening techniques and my stories about Frank and the early days of our marriage when we had had nothing but each other and big dreams about what we could build together. We restored Frank's workshop to its original organized chaos, bringing back the coffee-stained blueprints and the half-finished projects that honored the man who had built the foundation for everything we were celebrating. The house began to feel like home again. Not because it looked exactly the same as before, but because it was filled with respect rather than assumption, with inclusion rather than control. I learned something valuable about the difference between being helpful and being invisible, between giving generously and giving everything away without acknowledgement or appreciation. Frank had taught me to be strong. This experience taught me when and how to use that strength in service of principles that mattered more than temporary peace. The property deed still hangs in my hallway, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that respect isn't automatic, that love requires recognition, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people you care about is refuse to let them take you for granted. Some people might say, "I was too harsh. That family should forgive everything without question or consequence." But I have learned that unconditional love doesn't mean accepting conditional respect. The people who matter most deserve our honesty, even when it is uncomfortable, especially when it is uncomfortable enough to create real change. The farm continues to evolve with the seasons, as it always has, and always will. I tend my garden and maintain Frank's workshop and welcome visitors who understand that this place represents more than photogenic rural scenery. It is a testament to the idea that ordinary people can build extraordinary legacies through daily choices made with love and intention and the stubborn refusal to settle for less than they deserve. When young couples ask about renting the property for their weddings, I tell them about the farm's history, about the hands that built the foundation for their celebration, about the love that makes their joy possible, because everyone deserves to know the story that holds them up, the sacrifices that made their happiness possible, and everyone deserves to be seen, acknowledged, and respected for who they are and what they have given. Even mothers, especially mothers. Most of all, mothers who have spent a lifetime making sure everyone else felt important while forgetting to insist on their own worth. I will not be invisible anymore. I will not shrink to make others comfortable. I will not apologize for taking up space in my own life. And neither should you. What do you think about standing up for yourself, even when it means uncomfortable conversations with the people you love most? Have you ever felt erased by your own family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember to like and subscribe for more stories about finding your voice when it matters most.